This episode of Passing the Plate is sponsored by Storied Book Recipes from Storied.com. Welcome to Passing the Plate, the podcast that's all about food, traditions, and the wonderful connections they create. I'm Lisa Lisson, the genealogist and family history expert behind Are You My Cousin?
And I'm Ashley Covelli, the food writer and recipe developer behind Big Flavors from a Tiny Kitchen. We'll be your guides on this flavor-packed adventure. We're not just talking about recipes. We're diving into family history, exploring new cultures, and preserving favorite recipes for future generations. In short, we're celebrating the stories and tastes that come with every bite.
So grab a seat at the table and let's embark on a journey of flavor, tradition, and connection. This is Passing the Plate, where every episode is a feast for the senses and a celebration of the ties that nourish our souls.
We're all familiar with cakes and pies, but what about alternate ways of combining crust and fruit? Today we'll dive into the differences in some of these lesser-known baked goods. So, Lisa, when we were planning out this episode, you came across a term for a type of dessert that I had never heard of before. Can you share a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. So this was a really interesting tidbit, and I can even share more about it in a minute because it bumps right up into my family history.
Mm.
But the dessert is actually called a sonker, Sonker. That's a very unique dessert, and it is native or only really found in Surrey County, North Carolina. Now, that's up in the foothills of North Carolina. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous area of the state. It is also where I have done a large amount of genealogy and family history research because my grandmother was from there and many generations back. So this is an area I like to think I know a lot about, but in all of that, in all of my North Carolina history and heritage, I'd never heard of a sonker.
Oh, never came across it in an old recipe file from your
No,
ancestors?
it wasn't
Ah.
anything that would have been that in my memory was passed down. I know my grandmother never made this. And
Mm.
so what is a sonker, guys? So we are talking about pies and variations of fruit desserts. And a sonker is actually it's a deep dish fruit-based dessert. And it is similar to cobblers. It can be people often compare it to cobblers, but here's where it's different. Okay. It uses very juicy fruits, can even use sweet potatoes.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Yeah, and they are in a dough or a batter crust, and so because there's a lot of moisture when it cooks, they tend to sink. So it tends to sink down, and then they often will serve it with a glaze or a dip that comes on top of it, which is going to be made of like cream and sugar and a vanilla extract. It is so it has a very irregular look to it, and because again, it has that sunken look to it because the crust just sort of sinks with all the fruit filling. It can look a little soupier. My thinking is it is probably served in a bowl, would
Okay,
be my guess,
right.
because it's much juicier than, say, like a cobbler or something like that.
And the glaze,
So
it's like I'm picturing like when they drizzle it over like a cinnamon roll or something kind of like an icing type of glaze, like
I'm
a
not sure
drizzle.
if I actually was picturing something a little runnier than, say, like you would put
Like
over
that
a
wouldn't hold its
cinnamon.
shape.
Right, that wouldn't hold its
Hmm.
shape, so that
Okay.
would be kind of what I would picture for that, and my guess is too that it varied, that glaze probably varied quite a bit, as well, but, it's really considered it's a very practical dessert for farm workers. Now, y at the time this particular dessert kinda came into being, what they were starting to see is that it was or what the history of it is they think that it was introduced by Scottish and Scots-Irish immigrants who settled in that area in the early 1700s. And so thinking that they would have brought either that specific type of dessert, maybe they just made do with what they had there. But again, this was a very rural area, it still is. And so it was really a way to make use of maybe some of that fruit or sweet potato, shall we say, but it's overripe. So maybe
Mm.
it's not good fruit for just eating. Maybe it's too ripe to go into other recipes, but this was a good way of making use of it. And well, it sounds delicious because it sounds super sweet too, right?
Yeah. Well, and I'm wondering in your research that you came across, did you see if it's still something that is enjoyed often today, or have people moved on?
It's still kind of I think it's still enjoyed today. It would be My guess is probably more of a, within the families and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
but at home. But I think it's still very much like maybe you would make a cobbler at home or say a blueberry buckle somewhere in there. And we're going to talk about those terms in a minute, guys. But just like you would make, say, a cobbler for whatever occasion, yeah, you could still see this being made.
Okay, interesting. I'm like curious if I were to like stop in Surrey County, North Carolina, if I would come across a little small hole in the wall restaurant that would have that on the menu, you know?
So there is actually, I actually found a brochure on it. They have what they call a Surrey Sonker Trail.
Yeah. I think that's actually when that's how this kind of term came up when we were uh thinking about doing this episode. I was like, I need to know. I've heard about donut trails, wine trails, things like that, but I had not heard of a Sonker trail, let alone a Sonker.
Yes, so it is actually, they even have a festival for it. I just realized
Oh,
they have the
when's that?
Sonker Festival. It is the first Saturday in October in Mount
Huh?
Airy, North Carolina.
Every year?
Seems to be so. It began in 1980, and it is presented by the Surrey County Historical Society. And so the Historical Society, is part of the Surrey County Heritage. Obviously, they do things to promote the Sonker Trail, and the Sonker Festival. So, is that not really cool? And
Yeah, so I'm like scrolling through my calendar. So it's the first Saturday in October, you said?
yes.
So that means this year it would be October 4th, 2025. Interesting.
And I think, it has occurred to me. I think I'm saying it correctly. It's possible I'm mispronouncing it, but it's spelled Sonker. So I pronounce it
Interesting.
Sonker.
So when we were talking about sonkers, we were trying to figure out like, okay, so how is that different from a crisp, crumbles, all these things. So we thought it would be kind of interesting to break down and compare the differences so we have our terminology for all these delicious fruit/sweet potato items. So we're all on the same page. So when it comes to crisps, cobblers, and crumbles, they all tend to be easier to make than pies because they don't involve like making and rolling out a pie crust. Their crisps are fruit that's baked with a sugary streusel-like topping. It usually contains like oats, nuts, or sometimes both. And then the streusel is like a crumbly topping that's made out of butter, flour, and sugar. So it's, fruit in the pie pan topped with a crumble. You're not pleating dough and doing all that decorative stuff. So a lot more low maintenance. Crumbles then similar to the crisp, but it doesn't have oats or nuts in it. So cobblers are again a fruit base, and then the topping is a little different from a crisp or a crumble in that it's usually made from like a biscuit dough that's either dropped in dollops on top, or you could like carefully cut out biscuits and arrange them on top, and a lot of times sprinkled with sugar to kind of give it that nice little extra little crackly sweet topping.
You know, these all sound so wonderful, and
Mm-hmm.
it makes me want to bake when we get done
Yeah.
recording today. But even with crisp crumbles and cobblers, there's even more types of fruit pies or desserts, I should
Mm-hmm.
say. And so very similar to these cobblers that we're used to. And I think sometimes we use cobbler as kind of a
Catch all.
catch-all
Yeah.
term, basically. But there are three others. There is what's called a grunt, a slump, and a buckle. So here, hold on to your hats. Let's go for this.
What's
So,
funny about this though is all of these are, I'm just noticing this now, all of those are words for other things.
yeah, they are.
A
I wonder if that
grunt,
has
a
anything to.
slump, and a buckle. That's actually interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah.
Now, here's what I found interesting, and I did not know this, but the grunts and slumps are the same thing.
Oh.
I did not know that. I thought they were separate. So when I started to look into these a little more closely to see what the differences were between these, I found an article over on All Recipes on their in their blog, and it does indicate that, like I said, the grunts and the slumps are the same thing. That they are baked or stewed fruit dishes that are topped with the rolled biscuit dough. But a cobbler typically isn't a rolled dough. It would be
Right.
more of the dropped. So when you mentioned sometimes you could cut out the biscuits
Mm-hmm.
or roll the biscuits, then you're getting into the world of a slump. I
Slow.
don't know why. I don't know what the difference is, unless it really is maybe more regional, kind of
Right.
regional differences and regional names that came along together.
Yeah, it could be because I feel like I've heard of a grunt in food terminology, but I don't know that I had heard of a slump necessarily.
Yeah, I had heard of them. I didn't really know. I just remember always kind of just saying, "Okay, a cobbler." And
Mhm.
however it looks or whatever form it comes in, it'll be a cobbler type thing. I did never try to separate it out. And I have a feeling today's cooks don't get into all the
Yeah.
different small minute differences. But so if you have that, then you have what's called a buckle.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people have heard say like a blueberry buckle. That
Right.
was one I grew up hearing. I think there's probably partly because there's kind of that blueberry buckle, all your B's, your
Alliteration, yeah.
alliterations that are going on there. So a buckle can also be called a crisp, but it is which I thought was interesting, and it
Hmm.
is a moist fruit cake with streusel topping. And it gets
Okay.
its name, and the reason they call it a buckle is when you put the topping on it and it cooks, then the topping kind of buckles. It looks like a buckled appearance after it's baked.
Okay, because the fruit like oozes up a little bit and whatever.
I think so,
So
yes.
kind
I
of
think
like a
that was
sonker a little bit.
a little bit, but I think this is probably not as moist as that. I think
Okay.
it's probably, um, they do refer to it as a moist fruit case, but it doesn't sound as soupy
Right,
either.
and
A
we're not
Sonker,
adding drizzles and stuff on top
in my mind, the
necessarily.
Sonker still looks. In fact, I have a picture of it on the brochure, and it is definitely a Sonker has. It's kind of soupy looking, actually, with all the.
Is there
There's
a
a lot of liquid there.
is there a website for the Sonker Trail?
There is,
Okay,
and
we'll
I
link
will
that
have.
in the show
Yeah,
notes because I'm curious after this. I need to look up and see what that looks like because I am, like in my mind, I think I know what I'm in for, but I'm curious to see.
right, right. I thought it was really kind of interesting.
Yeah. This episode of Passing the Plate is sponsored by Storied Book Recipes from Storied.
With every recipe, shared meal, and story told at the table, we're building a living history.
And that's what Storied is all about. It's a place to discover, preserve, and share your family's story online for future generations.
Storied allows you to build a detailed family tree, uncover historical records, and even explore newspaper archives to bring your ancestors' stories to life.
I love that it's not just names and dates. It's about capturing the heart of who your family is. Things like where they came from, what was important to them, how they lived, and even the things that they cooked in their daily lives.
Whether you're just starting out or deep into genealogy research, Storied makes it easy and meaningful to connect the dots and keep your legacy alive.
So while you're passing the plate, don't forget to pass on the stories too. Visit storied.com/plate or use code PLATE to save 20% and begin your journey today. I think we're kind of going, some things we've heard before, some things we haven't. This one, I feel like it's like 50-50 on whether the people I know have heard of this before, which is a tarte tatin. And that's a French pastry in which fruit is caramelized in butter and sugar before it's baked. So, from my internet research disclaimer, but from my research, it shows that it was originally made with two regional apple varieties, Pippins and Calville, but in modern times it's made with a variety of different apples. Looking to the experts on what type of apples to use, Julia Child recommended using Granny Smith because she said they don't turn mushy. But people use pears, peaches, pineapple, and even savory items like tomatoes or onions can also be made in the style of a tarte tatin. It's named after the Tatin, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing this right, but the Tatin sisters who ran a hotel in the south of Paris in the 1880s. So the origin story, as most things in history, a little bit up for debate. There's, a couple different theories, but the most common one is that Stephanie Tatin, who did most of the cooking, was overworked. She started making a traditional apple pie, but she left the apples cooking in butter and sugar for too long, and she smelled the burning, tried to rescue the dish by throwing the pastry base on top of the apples instead of putting it in a pie dish underneath, and just popped the whole thing in the oven to finish cooking quickly. And then when she turned the upside down tart, out onto a serving platter or whatever, the hotel guests really enjoyed it. So it became a signature dish of their hotel. And this person I had not heard of, but apparently I need to do a deep dive into this author. Kurnowski, Curnosky, was apparently one of the most celebrated writers on gastronomy in France in the 20th century. He's the one who dubbed it the Tarte Tatin. So I guess he's a very prolific food writer back in the day. So I'm curious to do a little bit of a dive into more on him.
Oh, I can definitely see you getting lost into that world.
Absolutely.
Research on him. And, what struck me is that I think with the tarte tatin, like many really favorite desserts or meals, is they start out as one thing with the intention
Mhm.
of being one thing, but a mistake,
Yeah.
I would say, or, you know, something that goes wrong actually turns it into a favorite food.
Yeah.
I think of the chocolate chip cookie. I think that was one of them too, the way chocolate chips were created. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a really cool story.
Well, it's also very
Um,
Bob Ross, that whole like there are no mistakes, there are only happy accidents. So,
yes,
it's
happy
very,
accident.
although with baking it seems like it would be a little more temperamental, but it seems to have worked out for them in this instance.
Yes. Oh, I want to try. Now I want to try one of those actually.
Yeah.
It sounds delicious. All right. Well, next up, I did mention Betty's earlier. So we had the Buckles and then we have Betty's, and there's, um, I often wonder who Betty was, but a Betty is another type of fruit dessert. And according to the Farmer's Almanac blog, that wrote a lovely post on the description of a Betty, it is similar to a crisp. I think they all are,
Yeah, sounds like it.
but it also has no oats in the buttery crumb topping. So it has a buttery crumb topping, and it is actually doesn't really have a buttery crumb topping. The buttery crumb mixture, it's not on top, but it's mixed within the fruit. So you have
Oh,
kind of
interesting.
so you're gonna have fruit and buttercrumb mixture together. So it's just gonna kind of bake
Okay.
throughout. Yes, but you're not gonna have any oats in it as well.
So I
So
wonder if that would be more like if it would make it a little more dense throughout as opposed because the crumb is like mixed in there. I would think it would kind of like absorb it a little, almost more cakey than the others, I would
I thought
think.
so. I that was my impression was that this looks a little cakier as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to, say, a cobbler or a sunker that's a lot moister,
Mm-hmm.
or has a lot more moisture in it. So yeah, I think that that would definitely be a little cakier.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I say agreed, but I don't know that I've had a Betty. I'm not sure.
I don't
Um,
know that I have either, or if I did, I didn't recognize it at the time
right,
as such.
right. Um, the last one that we'll touch on today is what I always think of as kind of the oddest sounding word. So I was very interested to dive into what does this mean, and that's a pandowdy. So a pandowdy is a most commonly a dish made with baked spiced apples and brown butter, topped with either scraps or strips of puff pastry or pie crust. Some recipes that I came across had that it topped with a more shortcake type biscuit. And we're going to link to a post from Illinois University's Storied magazine, where they actually recreate a 1933 apple pandowdy based on a recipe that they found in a cookbook that was tucked away at the university's library and the collections on their third floor. So they note the difference between a pandowdy and a crumble or cobbler as being as the term dowdy, which means to press down on the crumb topping with the back of a spoon so that the juices from the simmering apples spill up and over the topping. When done partway through the cooking, it creates a caramelized crust. So they're actually intentionally pausing the baking to make some indentations to then have it come up and make that frumpy appearance, whatever, but they're calling it dowdy.
That's
So,
fascinating.
right. I've done where you like lower the oven temperature after a certain amount of time, but I don't think I've ever done where you take it out and do something else to it before you put baked good back in like that. Um, in the recipe they found, they also they used stale bread instead of a traditional butter, flour, brown sugar topping, which they said it's likely reflective of the Depression era during which this particular version of the recipe was created. And there's also a video in that post that shows them making the classic dessert. So I thought that was really fun, and it kind of reminded me again of a lot of the conversations Lisa and I have had here, talking about using what you have, things being reflective of the era in which they were created, and like pivoting a dessert. Like maybe these people were used to making cobblers, pies, whatever, but they ended up needing to use up that stale bread, so they kind of changed it around a little bit to make it more economical, or using what's in season.
It's always some of my favorite parts of history, even whether we're looking at researching, your ancestors and why your ancestors did something at a certain time or a certain place. But the same thing with the recipes is, what was happening in the world at large that could have impacted how that recipe was made during that time, or how it evolved over time. But I have to laugh, Ashley, because you were talking about some of the oddest, that pandowdy was the oddest term you'd heard. And I'm thinking, after all of the things that we've talked about with the sonker and the buckles
Yeah.
and the and the slump, I was like, it's an odd one. But I was like, there might be a couple others that are some of the strange too.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. If there's a weird culinary term that we're not that familiar with, I'm totally open to doing another research experiment. It's always so interesting.
That would actually be a really fun experiment to do. An
Yeah.
episode on different terms and things. So I love that. But now I want to make a pandowdy because it sounds absolutely delicious. And it obviously, with using apples, my guess is it was most often made in the fall during apple season. And so I think I might have to try that this year.
And then going back to the Tarte Tatin, like I wonder if you could also do a pandowdy with like tomatoes and leeks or something like that. So a savory one, because there's savory tomato tarts, and I feel like that could be really good.
Yes.
We're bringing back pandowdies.
We're bringing back pandowdies. Is it a pandowdy if it's not sweet?
If a pandowdy falls in the woods and nobody's around to hear it.
No, but I love that idea because I've done tarts. I don't know if you call it a tart or not, where I made I want to say almost a rough crust or something, which is kind of and filled it with cherry tomatoes, because I had a bumper crop one year, and made basically a savory tart that way, and it was delicious.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have experiments to do. I see in our
for
future.
Science,
for science, and certainly just and so that you listeners can we'll do all the work for you.
Yeah,
and take care of that. So anyway, all right, guys, we would love for you to find the links for some of these non-pie desserts in the show notes for this episode at passingtheplate.org/61.
That's a wrap on this episode of Passing the Plate. We hope you enjoyed our journey into the world of food, traditions, and the amazing connections they create.
It's been a pleasure sharing these stories and flavors with you. Remember, food is more than just sustenance. It's a way to connect with our past, present, and future.
So keep sharing your meals, keep passing those plates, and keep creating memories that will last a lifetime. Head to passingtheplate.org/podcast for show notes.